breakdown of Bergfrieden led to a lot of problems for the Weimar government, as the divisions that were present before the war returned. These divisions led to many fundamental problems with some parts of the constitution, including proportional representation. The ending of Bergfrieden meant that few political parties were willing to work together, and as no one party achieved majority within the government, very little could be done, because anything put forward by one party would be shot down by others. The end of Bergfrieden was followed by the creation of more extremist parties such as the KPD and USPD, who started uprisings in key cities all over Germany, such as the left-wing Spartacist uprising. These extremist parties have very different and radical ways they believe the country should be run. This made it hard for the Weimar government to appeal to them, as they were either right or left-wing. This also made it hard for the parties to work together, as their ideas were so polarised that a compromise would have been almost impossible to achieve. This inability of the parties to work together was key in leading to the failure of the Weimar government. Despite the fact that Bergfrieden increased the division between the various political parties, it didn't stop some parties working together. In January 1919, the STB was the largest party in the Reichstag. However, it didn't have a majority, so it relied on the support of the Catholic Centre Party and the DDP to help it pass its policies. All these parties were more left-wing and looked for a compromise between socialist change and liberal democracy. This coalition between parties meant that despite the failure of Bergfrieden, it was still possible for the Weimar government to succeed.
Germany's history had little time for democracy. Led by Kaisers and aristocrats through the First and Second Reichs, a strong authoritarian leader with a military solely answerable to them were the expectations of the German people for the governing of their country. A move this fast to democratic political representation, where one strong leader is rarely found, provides evidence as to why it may have been difficult for the people of Germany to adjust to the Weimar. Furthermore, some main groups opposed the Weimar due to the history of the country, which the Weimar desperately needed on side to create an efficient government: the military and the judiciary. The army stood to protect its own interests and not that of the state, to which it felt it owed no allegiance or loyalty. Previously in the history of Germany, the army had been positioned above the Reichstag, and orders from the Reichstag to the army could simply be ignored. They were answerable only to the Kaiser. With no military protection due to Germany's historical past, it would have been extremely hard for the Kaiser to protect them, therefore evidencing that the Republic was doomed from the start. The judiciary were also a pre-war caste, with their sympathies lying in Germany's past. Article 54 of the new Weimar Constitution stated that the judiciary maintained their independence. Being an upper-class, pro-aristocratic caste, which benefited from the Kaiser and his upper-class ideals, they used this article to undermine the spirit of the Constitution. Their purposeful misinterpretation of the Constitution posed great threat to the Republic, with many judges showing bias against the Republic and leniency towards those seeking to destroy it. An example of this is the Erzberger case of 1920. Erzberger was resented amongst anti-republics, as he was a politician who argued in favour of the Treaty of Versailles. The DNVP leader Helfrich, who were a pro-militaristic conservative party against the Republic, accused Erzberger of fraud and corruption. The judiciary found him guilty, leading to his resignation from the Weimar. As a major politician, it was a real blow to the government. This suggests that the Weimar could easily be manipulated by other classes that resented the new government due to Germany's history. Right-wingers loathed the idea of Germany becoming a republic in which the government was responsible to the elected representatives of the people, and actively campaigned for the restoration of the monarchy. However, the abdication of the Kaiser was welcomed, as it meant the anger associated with defeat and peace settlements would be put into the hands of the Republic. However, there was some support for the Weimar Republic. Workers felt unfairly treated by the Kaiser, who mainly ruled for the upper classes and had little time for them. They saw the confusion at the conclusion of the war as the perfect time for the establishment of a communist or socialist regime. It was the socialists who were the leading driving force in the Weimar Republic. This suggests that the Republic was not doomed from the start, as they had the support of a large majority of the population who disagreed with Germany's historical regimes. But these groups also hoped for a revolution which would put their parties in complete control. With a majority of the influential groups in Germany opposing the Weimar, it is evident that Germany's history made them doomed from the start, despite encouragement and support from the working classes. After World War I ended and Germany was defeated, they returned to their country with heavy losses, a £6.6 billion reparation cost, and a feeling of being let down. The country suffered huge economic losses and fell into poverty and starvation. Any government ruling a country in such a state would have found it extremely difficult to be efficient. This proves that Weimar was bound to be a disaster from the beginning.
In the beginning, Weimar faced opposition from both the left wing and the right wing. Communists, on the left, had no respect for the government, and the success of Lenin in Russia had boosted their self-belief. Those on the right, former soldiers, were still bitter about the armistice and defeat in the war. They also had no respect for the government, as it had betrayed them, linking to the November criminals. Royalists, who wanted the Kaiser back, had no respect for the government as well, as it had been the Social Democrats who had told the Kaiser to abdicate. The civilian population was still suffering from the effects of the war. Both the left and right wing attempted to overthrow the Weimar. The Spartacists, German communists, also had the support of sailors who had not been paid. They wanted Germany to be run by workers, or councils similar to what they thought was happening in Lenin's Russia. On December 23, 1918, 1,000 sailors broke into the government headquarters and held Ebert captive. They demanded their owed pay and increase in their wages. Government soldiers did not attack fellow military men, and Ebert had to give in. Inspiring the Spartacists, who renamed themselves the German Communist Party on December 30, 1918, they announced their desire for a full-scale communist takeover of Germany, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. On January 6, 1919, the German communists started their takeover attempt. By this time, the government had found an unlikely ally in the Freikorps. These right-wing nationalists hated communists more than Ebert's Social Democrats and agreed to help Ebert put down the revolt by the communists. By January 15th, the Freikorps had crushed the communists and murdered Luxemburg and Liebknecht. In this sense, there was no German revolution, in that the German communists had tried to overthrow the government but failed miserably. In March 1919, what was left of the German communists attempted another takeover. The Freikorps was called in to crush them, and within a few days had killed over 1,000 people. Ebert had again ordered that anyone seen carrying a weapon was to be shot dead. The Freikorps had once again saved the government and restored order. Ebert's next problem was in southern Germany, in the state of Bavaria. As early as November 1918, independent socialists had set up a republic in Bavaria. It was led by Kurt Eisner. A right-wing student shot Eisner dead in February 1919, and the socialists and communists there fell out on how Bavaria should be governed after Eisner's death. The communists won out, and a Soviet Republic of Bavaria came into being. This was a clear challenge to the authority of Ebert. The army and the Freikorps was asked to deal with the problem. The main city in Bavaria, Munich, was put under siege, and by April, food in the city was in very short supply. On May 1, 1919, soldiers from the army assisted the Freikorps, took over Munich, killing at least 600 people, including children. The Weimar Republic also faced opposition from the right. The Freikorps, who were nationalists and usually former soldiers, angered at what they saw at the government's betrayal of the German army in 1918. To gain public support, on November 12, 1918, Ebert issued to the German people. This was a statement of what he wanted to introduce for Germans. He promised freedom of religion, freedom of speech, an end to censorship, a house-building program, and an 8-hour day for the workers. The Freikorps had seen how Ebert was reliant on their power to overthrow challenges to his authority. It was apparent that Ebert needed them more than they needed him.
The Treaty of Versailles was signed by Germany in June 1919 and was met with great resentment from the German government and the public. They thought the treaty would be based on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, and the harsh terms of the treaty were met with bitter shock. The signing of the War Guilt Clause also led to some problems for the Weimar Republic. The people of Germany were not happy to accept that their country started the war, or even that they lost it. By signing the Treaty of Versailles, the German government not only agreed to pay a large sum of reparations to the Allies, but also opened themselves up to a large amount of criticism from the public. This agreement led to a significant decrease in the national pride of the German people. Those in the upper middle classes and the government also had their pride knocked when their roles in society were taken away from them, as they were unable to handle the new harsh trade terms of the treaty. This resulted in the destruction of the Prussian upper classes, who were deemed responsible for the war by the Allies. This led to a large growth in the support for anti-democratic groups due to both the change in social order and the poor handling of the treaty by the Weimar government. Some of these groups were allowed to object to the nature of the government, which undermined it further. This led to a loss of support for the government and meant that the treaty doomed the Weimar Republic from the start. Germany had no choice in signing the Treaty of Versailles due to the extent of damage the war had inflicted on Germany, and the military had made it obvious defending the Allies was impossible. The nation was so exhausted from the 4 years of war, and the country's morale was so severely damaged that there was little public support for further fighting. Despite the military advising the government to sign the treaty due to their incapability to fight any more against the Allies, Hindenburg's testimony to the Investigation Committee of the National Assembly suggested otherwise. Undoubtedly, the effect of the severe sanctions on the Treaty of Versailles was harsh and difficult for Germany to handle as a country, and was presented humiliatingly. The loss of land and army restrictions were particularly hard for the German nation to comprehend, as it ruined the country's pride in their history. Hindenburg and other officials found the treaty so humiliating, relating to Germany's militaristic heritage, and could not afford their military pride to be dented. As a result, the November criminals myth emerged, and the idea of the stab in the back that Germany's armed forces had been undermined by politicians who signed the Treaty of Versailles. Despite Hindenburg with Ludendorff suggesting armistice in 1918, Hindenburg brought these ideas and accusations in his speech to the Investigation Committee of the National Assembly. This was hypocritical of Hindenburg. The November criminals were grouped into a clique of the anti-patriotic sentiment left-wing politicians who founded the revolution following the war described by Hindenburg. They were used as scapegoats who were also blamed for the stab in the back of the army which led to military collapse. The idea was so easily accepted by the German public as the politicians were easy scapegoats instead of blaming the failures of the military as the resentment for the treaty increased. The myth gained support and accusations were widely accepted as it gave an explanation for defeat and a way to channel frustrations of the treaty. The sudden change in government straight after the defeat of the war would always face severe problems as the consequences and serious damage the war impacted on the country would be difficult to relieve instantly. But the myth of the November criminals and the stab in the back seriously intensified this. The myths allowed to easily persuade the public into believing the myths were true and were used against the politicians of the Weimar government. The increased and continued hatred for the results of the Treaty of Versailles became an obvious threat for the Republic and seriously contributed to the downfall of the Weimar government.
On the 15th of November 1918, Democrat and lawyer Hugo Prius was charged with the responsibility of drawing up the new constitution, along with his colleagues. They had to consider many things, including the significant change brought about by a shift to democratic ruling, and ensure political stability in a Germany surrounded by revolution. They also had to consider the shift in power towards the Reichstag from the Kaiser, or president, and whether that would be carried through to the new constitution. Prius attempted to build on traditional German politics, as well as finding a balance of power between different institutions. The new Weimar Constitution was adopted on 31st July 1919. Some key points were: the new Reich was a federation of 18 regional states, or Länder. A president was voted for every 7 years who was granted some strong powers over the parliament. This central parliament was made up of two houses, the upper house being the Reichsrat, which was able to delay laws, and the members were elected by the parliaments in the Länder. The lower house, the Reichstag, was elected every 4 years and elected by proportional representation. This was one key element that made ruling Germany extremely hard. Another was Article 48. While sometimes used to good effect, this was consistently used by presidents to undermine the Weimar Republic, and granted the executive large amounts of power that could be used as they saw fit. This would prove to help Hitler's destruction of the constitution.